Legislation and policies are constant subject to change. Is there something to ensure that, especially policies for inclusion, are more sustainable and not overturned by the next government?
Yeah, there's a tendency in New Brunswick, like other places, to review the previous government's policies, and that dates back through time. And New Brunswick is no different. So in 1985, when legislation was first initiated to start merging our schools and to bring the special schools into mainstream schools, and we had called them auxiliary classes, and they were merged in with mainstream schools. The new government, after 1987, initiated a review. But that review, after working with the community and the partners, and came to the same conclusions, that inclusion was best. Here's the need for here's the need for improvement. And then we had another example would be our policy that was passed in 2013. Government changed in 2014. In 2015, the government initiated a review, not just solely on that policy, but it included inclusion policy. And with involvement from the community, parents, families, teachers, again, the review was succeeded in saying the policy is correct, the understanding of it, the implementation of it, the resourcing of it needs to be improved. So I don't know the answer, except the more we can involve our partners, the more cross-political involvement there is, the more the partners are involved, the unions and community advocacy organizations are involved and understand, the more we reach out to different diverse groups. Inclusion has become in New Brunswick more than just disability. It's new immigrants, English as a second language in New Brunswick, it's LGBTQ, it's Indigenous learning. There's a wide variety of diversity. And when you have organizations that represent the diverse groups of people, and if they work together of a common understanding, that can help with sustaining policy change. And sometimes we have to trust the public and trust the community partners that they'll come to the same conclusions, that inclusion and diversity is best as the first statement of values. And then how do you get there? It's the how that can be the hardest.
So basically building a coalition of partners that have an interest in a wide definition of inclusion and educational support in schools.
Yeah, and there's some debate about that. So having a wide diversity of community stakeholders to advocate for inclusive practices that includes more than disability is the ideal. And the problem with some minority groups is they might feel that when you are included as part of the larger group, then you become the minority and you're not as included. So from a policy legislative perspective, yes, you would like to have as much public support, community support, as long as we know that as long as we agree on what inclusion is and the values are, and we don't stop with the word but, that we are all truly valued in an inclusive system. And I think we're getting there.
Yeah, but sometimes you have special interest groups within those communities, and they say, well, why are we not the focus anymore?
Yeah, and there's fear.
Yeah.
So if we're not the main focus, then we might not be any focus, so then we're fearful. And so we're always trying to give people benefit and try to say, let's work together. And when you think about it, a new immigrant with a need for language learning may also be part of another minority group that may also be part of another minority group. So the way we label, we don't always want people with disabilities labeled, because we can open up to greater opportunities by valuing the individual, would be the same potentially as not labeling the organizations, and knowing that people can belong to multiple organizations based on who they are. They may be on multicultural, new immigrants committee, but they may be on an LGBTQ committee. They may also have dyslexia and have an intellectual, and they're on another committee. So the more we can broaden our understanding of what inclusion is and support that holistic, universal understanding of opportunities in the best inclusive classroom, is better. Challenging, but better.
Yeah. But people could argue that they become invisible in this. Okay, we don't label anymore approach, and then, for example, their disability becomes invisible.
I know. Yeah, because even within the disability community, there's a proportion of percentage of who everyone is based on what their label. I guess it's hard to get away completely from a label, but you have a mobility disability, or you have an intellectual and a mobility, and you have behavior and autism and and deaf and blind. So even within, it can sometimes be hard to be recognized as a need, and to be involved with change. And then to broaden from there to other organizations or other additional labels. And so the idea in New Brunswick was, we really tried to have a conversation in 2010, 2012, 2013, when I was minister, about what is inclusion, and recognizing, honoring, and understanding individual inclusion, but also as a larger inclusion. It takes a lot of partnership and a lot of trust and a lot of good faith to work together.
Because it's also about voices being heard and seen.
Yeah.
And for example, people with intellectual disabilities might have less power than wheelchair users and blind people with an academic background in positions of power.
Yeah.
And did you have a way to ensure the participation of all groups?
Yeah, well, so I think that's the especially with intellectual disability, it's the role or the balance of getting the input from parents, families, and the advocacy organizations, as well as individuals directly, but to, I guess, supplement that power imbalance with the advocacy organization. In New Brunswick, our provincial advocacy organizations and disability actually work quite closely together, and that helps a government. When the organizations work together, then you can provide unified voice to the government. When the community is divided, then the governments have less appetite to make change.
Is there a political discussion around inclusion in New Brunswick?
Inclusive education in New Brunswick has always been political, and always has a level of debate. When you research back to the beginnings of institutionalization in the 1800s, and merging from a penal kind of prison system to a hospital system of institutionalization, and then in the 1980s moving from an institutional system into a community system, debate continues. And then in our school system, going from a special education, auxiliary classroom, special classrooms, into more inclusive classrooms. anything that touches our hearts and it has emotion and it touches our values will lead into a public discourse. And that has happened in New Brunswick, as it happens in every other seems to be jurisdiction that allows that type of public discourse. So that's a good thing. It's just that it's an ongoing political discussion, and it's an ongoing awareness that's required early in the political process, meaning ideally there's good candidates that are elected that understand. When they don't necessarily understand the background, then there's good intervention and good communication strategies with our elected officials and our departmental officials and our families. There's a whole range of strategies that are required for change to happen. And in New Brunswick, another advantage is our smaller size of being able to connect and know people. So that's been another advantage I probably should have mentioned before in terms of teachers' unions, principals, parent organizations, elected officials, departmental officials. We are generally neighbors of some sort, and knowing the right connections and having the opportunities to influence understanding, I think, has helped us in New Brunswick.
So you were the Minister for Education and also later then Minister for Secondary and Post-Secondary Education, right?
Correct.
Did you experience differences in those two fields regarding inclusive education?
So from 2010 to 2013, I was Minister for Education and Early Childhood Development, which was all of the public education, which was secondary, as well as early childhood education. And then for a year from 2013 to 2014, I was post-secondary education, human rights, private colleges, and community college. And so what I noticed, it was quite a unique opportunity to do both. And I found post-secondary education and employment in the community was far more inclusive than our education system. So even though we're quite inclusive in our education system, there's challenges as well, but what we were able to do in the post-secondary employment branch was provide funding to the public education system to look at more skills development. So, for example, workplace essential skills. There are 9 elements of skills that are divided. Some had called them 21st century skills, but they're basically, now that we're almost 25 years into the 21st century, I don't call it that. But they're essential skills. And the last 10 years' work in our school systems are to try to teach to skills, not to subjects. And in our Francophone education in New Brunswick and Anglophone English, both systems have been working to develop, in addition to your graduation certificate, a skills profile, a skills report card that says, here's your skills. So what I learned, I guess, is doing both jobs, I really think the focus on skills can be an additional support for inclusive education.
What should be next steps?
In New Brunswick, next steps for... Well, I think that probably the next steps would be consistent with all the previous reports that have said what the steps are required. So I think we have to keep kind of looking at, I guess, policy and looking at best practice. But most of the reports that have been tabled since 1970 all say the same thing, that in New Brunswick, inclusive education is good, but you need to work on these key elements. And those key elements have not been all implemented. For instance, our teacher education universities could be more focused on inclusion as opposed to a separate course on inclusion, as an example. But there's elements of leadership, of resources, of behavior, addressing behavior, integrated services. It shouldn't take 2 years to get a behavioral assessment. So there's still lots of needs, and I would say, well, go back to as a basis of what the previous reports have said, and likely a new report would say the same thing, that there's some key elements that you need to focus on for planning, for process, and for legislative change, and keep working on them.